I will make, and I have been making the same questions to other people that are coming from different religions. And the first one will be your relation with what we call now the new atheism, that is really re-emerging. We have talked about Richard Dawkins. He has provoked, and he has mentioned, like Freud many years ago, that probably we create God because of our needs, and that science have been proving another culture, another way to see things. How do you read Richard Dawkins and all these new theories?
Well, they make some very good points. They make some points that, in fact, some of our best religious thinkers historically have made, which is that it's very easy for us to confuse our own desires, our own needs, our own will for power with God's will. In fact, the ultimate spiritual challenge is that struggle with yourself. The scholars of the Islamic tradition said that you don't know God if you don't know yourself. So we can benefit, and it's very much in my tradition that we can benefit from psychology, we can benefit from sociology, from knowing how our circumstances, and as well as our own upbringing and history, our genetics, how these influence us, how these impact us. But that is, from my perspective, that has nothing to do with belief in God or not, because I see all of this under the rubric of a universe that was God created. And people like Dawkins and others, they use they refute some of the more simplistic explanations of God's existence, proof for God's existence, that I simply don't subscribe to. Essentially, in my perspective and from the Islamic perspective, knowledge of God is an internal conviction that is known, not believed in. It's not a leap of faith, but it's a knowledge that is experiential.
Can you argue that the people that don't believe, for example, in God, could be good, could do good, could be in a good world? How could you explain their behavior, or you don't understand them well in that sense?
No, absolutely. And in fact, according to Islamic theology, all human beings are born good and with an internal sense of right and wrong. Islam doesn't believe in original sin. But at the same time, we don't believe that people are born outside of history. So that a human being who comes into the world has no burden of sin, but is immediately formed by whether the mother is attentive and loving or is negligent or abusive. Immediately that potential for goodness to grow is either pushed back and crippled, or it is nurtured. And so what that means is that, for my understanding, from an Islamic perspective, there's no way for any of us to not be responsible for the spiritual and emotional formation of others, because collectively we have to create a world in which human beings are nurtured, are loved.
Just following your words, how do you explain the bad, where it comes from, if we actually are built with this good thing?
Right. Well, we start with this, but we have desires, and these desires, if we do not balance our desire with
so these desires that we're born with,
and that in themselves are neutral. Desire desire for love, desire for attention, all of these things. As long as our reason is in balance, to put limits on these, then we're going to be able to fulfill these desires in a way that doesn't hurt other people.
Three things, three principles, three values that probably the West and many people have misunderstood about Muslims. I mean, for example, we have been talking about the role of women. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings that we really have to understand, at least from your perspective. the topic of course, of power and theocracy, and the topic that has to do with who is different and the war and the values and the causes. I think there's a lot of myths around all these things.
Yes.
If we could start really, and being, I'm sure there are many things from the way I see my own life that I don't like, and I can criticize about my country, about my values, etc. If you could also say, well, this even that I don't like it, it's this way, but here there is a big misunderstanding.
There's no doubt that there are many Muslims who use Islam as a tool to oppress women. That's true. You look across the Muslim world, and when there are acts of violence committed against women, very often it's with a religious justification. Now, why is that? Is it because Islam is more susceptible to that than other religions? I don't think so, because in fact what we see quite clearly from the Quran and from the story of the Prophet Muhammad is that the message was towards the increasing empowerment of women. He fought very hard to ensure their rights in a highly patriarchal tribal society. But what we have to understand is that Muslims, even at the beginning of the 21st century, tend to be more religious than many Western people. And so when they want to justify anything, good or bad, right, whether it's a political action, whether it's their own behavior, they're going to tend to revert to try to give a religious justification because that's the strongest argument. And so I think this is one of the main challenges for Muslims, is to continue to push back against these religious justifications for abuse, and maybe even in a way stop always using religion even for good arguments or for good policies, because in fact we have shared public interests, we have shared common interests with other people that we don't need to always articulate within a religious framework, because then, it's as susceptible to being manipulated or used for bad policies.
I agree. As well as you mentioned, like in 1 minute, if I mention you the word woman, and I mention now, for example, the relation with Israel, what would you say in 1 minute?
Well, it's very difficult. It's really very difficult, and it is so crucial, I believe, to world peace. Palestinians, although they're a small part of the population of the Muslim world, it is an issue that isn't just about national rights or the rights of a group to achieve their collective rights, but this is the place of holiness. Jerusalem is loved and considered holy by Muslims across the world. So we need to solve this problem. I believe it's possible to solve. And the reason why I believe it's possible to solve is that we've made very good progress recently in the United States in dialogue between American Muslims and American Jews, who tend to be the strongest supporters of the State of Israel. We're having some very difficult conversations that I think are paying off, and I do believe that it's possible in the future for us to come to some kind of...
I don't know if you saw this film, Promises, where kids from Palestine and kids from Israel get together, and all the stereotypes and all the things. And many people mentioned there, and in another debate, that there is a solution, and that the real problem behind everything, more than anything else, is poverty.
Right.
Poverty in the region, and with poverty comes problems on education, problems on health, problems on the way that you have to always find a scapegoat.
Right.
Doesn't matter from which side you are, but you have to find a scapegoat. Do you have that kind of paradigm? Do you share it?
I believe that's an important part of it. You simply, with things like water, for example, the more that some people take it, the more that the settlers on the West Bank use it to fill up their swimming pools, the less there is for drinking and for business for the Palestinians. So there are material reasons. But there are ideological reasons as well on all sides. It's absolutely true. there are Muslims who believe that it is absolutely impossible for them, from a religious perspective, to allow the state of Israel to exist, and there are Jews who believe that this land has been promised to them by God, and that other non-Jews are simply inferior human beings and do not have the same rights.